Everyone, good afternoon, good morning, good day. This is MOOC 8, Session 11, Cryptocurrency and Innovation. We have a actually pretty solid set of questions for this session, so I'm going to try and go through these questions, and if we have some time left, we'll see what other questions we can pick up from the audience. This is a good topic. It's interesting. This is different than any of the other sessions we've done in that this topic of innovation is broader than cryptocurrency. A lot of these topics are relevant in many other fields, but it does apply heavily in this area. And so it's a useful framework to think about in this field, because it is a generally useful framework to think about areas where there's a lot of technological change. All right, number one. Does the following hold some truth? Enterprise systems vendors are primarily preoccupied with maintaining and developing their customer base. They may opt for incremental innovation solutions when dealing with conservative customers. This may prove harmful to customers when a radically innovative market player successfully disrupts their business model and processes. This is not partially true. This is 100% true. I was just having a discussion seconds before I came online with our CTO about our enterprise systems that we use at the university, all of which are based on an existing model of how you would operate a university. And we were looking at different software vendors that have different types of systems, all of which are very conservatively managed, both for reasons that have to do with the vendor, but also reasons that have to do with the customer. So let's work through this example, because I think it's a very good and relevant example. In universities, the major system that runs a university is called an SIS, a Student Information System. And sometimes there's a CRM, a Customer Relationship Management System, on the front end for people who are inquiries. And sometimes these things are all together as one. So imagine you're a large vendor of SISs, and there's 4 or 5 large ones. And you have dozens or maybe even hundreds of universities as clients. And universities are big enterprise users, right? They're large organizations as a general rule. They have thousands of employees, tens of thousands of students, big IT systems, pretty big budgets, and lots of things happening. So someone puts in place an SIS. And what does an SIS do? It holds the class schedule, it holds students' grades, it helps process financial aid, it might create invoices, it checks disciplinary issues, it might even lay out your schedule for who graduates in what row when you're running your graduation ceremony, and hundreds of other of these topics. And so now you have hundreds of universities who have built their business processes around this system. I am SIS vendor X. Well, first of all, once I've built this system as a vendor, I don't want to rebuild it, right? I might have spent hundreds of millions, if not in some cases billions of development dollars to build what I have there. And so the optimal thing for me incrementally, in the incremental software development dollar, is to say, okay, I have all of this, and now I'm going to make a small improvement to this. And I'll make my system a little better. Maybe I can charge a little bit more. Maybe I can get past our next vendor, who's our immediate competitor. And that's optimal for the software vendor in terms of invested dollars. But it's not just the software vendor's fault. Because let me tell you who else doesn't want you, the software vendor, to radically redo the system. The hundreds of customers who have spent many years and millions of dollars to make their university run on this specific system in this specific way with these specific procedures, and trained everyone to use them. If tomorrow morning you said, hey, great, I'm blowing up everything about how the system used to work. And now we're going to have a completely different paradigm on how we record people's grades and classes and class schedule and your campus map and all these things. I don't think the customers on the whole will be very happy with it, because you've just created a whole bunch of work for the IT department, for the training department, for everyone in any office, in the registrar and the financial aid office. And so the customers aren't looking for radical innovation either. That's bucket number 2. But then there's an even bigger problem, which is bucket number 3, which is at any point in time for any software system, there are thousands of customer requests. Oh, it would be really great if we had a report that did this. Oh, it would be really great if the system also allowed us to operate in Chinese, because we have a lot of Chinese students. Oh, this form doesn't look nice on the iPad Pro. This thing hangs off the screen. So once you've built any sufficiently complex system with sufficiently large number of users, the incremental requests, the incremental tickets are endless. And the customers only come in with incremental requests. It is never the case that the customer is going to come say, yeah, please blow up the system altogether. Here's this brand new way of how I want to operate a university. What's going to happen is the people who are in the business units using a certain part of the system are going to say, I need to fine tune this, or I need to fine tune that, or I need to fine tune the next thing, and so on. So let's summarize it. I have a system. I'm making a lot of money. I'm a valuable company. I can maximize my immediate return on investment by making it incrementally better and raising the price a bit and keeping my customers satisfied. The customers don't want me to make a radical change, second. And third, the customers have 100 other very practical, straightforward, basic things they want me to do right now, immediately. In that environment, is it really feasible for either side to come radically change the system? No, it's not. Never is. And so this is why systems like this, or saying software, but there's all types of examples like this, are disrupted by people going and doing something very different. The very different isn't build all the existing system and then do some other thing. It's do some other thing and ignore the things that the existing system is doing. And usually what happens is the first version is vastly simpler. Usually, there's some other variations, but it's vastly simpler. And this is why there's a great article, blog post by Fred Wilson, I think, or is it? I can't remember if it's Fred Wilson or Paul Graham. It says new systems often look like toys. People say, oh, well, that's cute, but that's obviously not what we need. And so let's take some examples. Excel is the be-all, end-all Mercedes-Benz of spreadsheets, right? It does everything. It has thousands of features. You could be a total guru, and you still don't know how to use all the things that Excel can do. And then Google comes out with Google Sheets. And Google Sheets, I'm a power user of Excel. I'm a pretty good Excel user. And Google Sheets version 1 comes out, and it's hopeless. Like, oh my God, it doesn't have pivot tables. I can't run Monte Carlo simulations on it, all these things. And so 98% of the things that Excel does, it doesn't do. But what it does do is allow you and someone else and the fourth person and the sixth person and 10th person to real-time edit it together. And you know what? Probably like Google Sheets version 1 is probably best at is making a list. Surprisingly, if you actually do market research on this, a lot of people actually use spreadsheets to make lists. Sounds very silly, but that is actually a meaningful usage case of spreadsheets. So being able to make lists and being able to make lists that are shared instantaneously with someone else turns out to have a kernel of a useful feature that is much better than Excel. So Excel can do almost everything else better than Google Sheets on day one. But if me and my friends want to make the packing list for our, camping trip in the woods, instead of me creating an Excel and sending it to 5 friends, and then they make edits, and then we lose track of what the spreadsheet is, and who's bringing the tent, and who's bringing the marshmallows, and who's bringing the graham crackers so we can make s'mores. If we just create a Google Sheet and make that list there, and one friend says, yep, I'll bring this and I'll bring the other, all of a sudden, it works better for that very marginal usage case. And the product manager of Excel, that was like, oh, the power user of Excel, like, no, this is not Excel, this is some silly thing. It's a list-making tool. But that list-making tool gets a foothold. And then the next step is it adds another feature. And then it adds another feature. And then it adds another feature. And once it's added these features, someday it reaches the minimum viable capabilities to be a generally useful spreadsheets tool. And usually, because it started as this toy, it's much, much cheaper and much, much simpler. And it starts disrupting the incumbent from below. And the incumbent's general reaction is to go add more features because it's very hard to take away features, right? Like if I have Excel, it's very, okay, I'm going to take away all the features that my power users like in order to become consistent with this list-making version of Excel. So you start off with a cheap, free product. It doesn't do very much, but it does one thing well. It kind of looks like a toy, and then it builds up. And there's another thing that's not part of the disruptive innovation canon, but I think it's accurate, which is these things work best if they've also somehow latched on to a change in paradigm. So what do I mean? Google Sheets, if it was a piece of desktop software that somehow synced with other people's desktop software, I don't think would have worked, even if everything else in my story was exactly the same. Google Sheets answered the following question: not how do I make a better spreadsheet than Excel, because there is no better spreadsheet than Excel. Excel is still the Mercedes-Benz of spreadsheets. What Google Sheets answered is, what would a spreadsheet look like in a world where everyone lives in a web browser? And the answer to that question is, well, it's a network spreadsheet. Everyone can work on it simultaneously. And so then it built the 0.001 version of the networked spreadsheet. And the 0.001 version of the network spreadsheet was better at one very narrow thing, networked work, than Excel, and worse than everything else. But then you keep building. And suddenly you have all the features of a networked spreadsheet and sufficient number of normal spreadsheet features to be a competitive replacement. To Microsoft's credit, and I think tech companies tend to be okay at it. I mean, the top tech companies are very aware of this. This would be no news to any senior executive in the technology field. They actually reacted, and they built an online version of Excel and ran both of them in parallel, and we still have both of them in parallel. And right now, I mean, I use all three. Like I have Excel on my desktop, and for some things I use Google Sheets, and for some other things I think we do have Office 365 here at the university. Sometimes I use that. And so it was a good counter move by Microsoft. And so this will not be the story of Excel has gone away, because Microsoft actually reacted correctly. They went and also built the same thing, and then said, oh, this is added features works well with your Excel on your desktop and what have you. But that's rare, and I think it's more common in tech companies because tech companies tend to be the disruptors, and so they're more sensitive to this model. And by the way Microsoft had to react was not by making Excel like Google Sheets. They effectively just went and made a Google Sheets of their own. Yes, it's called Excel, but it's effectively Google Sheets. It's not Excel adapted to be like Google Sheets. It's a Google Sheets of their own. It's called Excel, and then they took the things they knew about running Excel, and so they went and made their own disruptive innovator. And that's what you have to do. Like the idea, the worst thing, and it's challenging because it's very hard for any business executive. You have a functioning product. You make good money from it. Your systems and your rewards and your targets and the way you assumes that your product costs, I don't know, what Excel costs $75, and you distribute on the desktop and it goes through distributors and you can buy it in stores and all these things. And then someone shows up and says, I'm going to give a worse version of your product away for free. Well, okay, that's kind of horrible, right? Like, what do you do about that? You're going to go offer your own product for free? You have quarterly targets to meet. You have annual earnings to send to Wall Street. Everyone's bonuses are linked, everyone's stock options are linked to the stock price, and so on. So all of your natural instincts, all of the institutional energy is going to be preserving the existing system. It is very hard to walk away from the existing system. For this to work, you have to then say, and I think it's the only way it can work, is you have to then say, well, I'm keeping the existing system going, and then I'm going to create someone else and say, you build the new system and compete without worrying about the existing system. And if you don't do that, competing with yourself or cannibalizing yourself, subject to some conditions and constraints, is usually the right strategy. Because if you don't cannibalize yourself, it usually doesn't mean that you won't get cannibalized. It just means someone else is going to cannibalize you. And so you might as well get on with it. If something new is possible and it allows your business model to be done better in some different way, it's better to put a stake in the new world and try and capture that value, either as a replacement for your current value or in addition to your current value, than to just let yourself get eaten away. But it's tough. It's tough. You have to say, and I think usually the best way to do it is you have to at least create some separation in the organization between the people doing the existing system and the people doing the new system, because the people doing the existing system, both their psychology will be so deep into the business model of the existing system, and also all their instincts will say like, oh, but this is going to hurt me in the short term. So the company kind of has to say, like, you guys keep doing what you're doing and max out the existing system. We're going to put these other guys here. We're going to do the new thing, and they don't have to worry about if they're competing with the existing team. This exists in universities, right? It's probably less controversial now in 2017, but it was very controversial initially. Teaching online. When online teaching first came out for universities, you can't imagine how many horrible things were said about it. And eventually some brave universities started doing it, and then kind of the later adopters started doing it. And there's some universities that still don't do it, but eventually every university is going to be doing it. And there's no version where it's not going to happen. And there will be fewer ground-based universities over time, because once you have online education, it allows people to scale across geographies. And of course, there still will be ground-based universities. And here internally, we offer programs on the ground, but we're also going to offer programs online. And this is a natural effect of technology making new things possible. And so this course we're doing right now is, what is a class if you can give a class in a web browser, right? And that wasn't a question in 1995. You couldn't. Didn't exist in 1995. So a classroom meant concrete and chairs and all these other things. And I worry about that for the university because I think a lot of traditional universities that have done online courses are doing an okay job of bridging the two. But I worry about people coming in more radically and being more disruptive on online and what that might mean. And I don't know. I think about it, right? Like this is the MOOC. This MOOC that we're in is part of our thinking. Well, let's give a course for free and let anyone sign up and let them take that course. And there are interesting implications. Like, for example, I don't think there has ever been a course at the University of Nicosia with 6,000 students in it, as we have this fall, ever. I'm pretty sure the largest lecture hall we had for a course was, I don't know, 60 or 80. And so it's very different to say there's 6,000 in a course as there are in this MOOC. So anyway, I kind of grabbed that question and gave my general theory on how disruptive innovation works, but I think it's a useful framework to think about things. It doesn't always apply, but like all frameworks, if you embed this as one of the filters to look at the world, sometimes it will turn out that that's a filter that has predictive power. And if there's one single thing that I would take away from this session, it's this: that disruptive innovation generally means you're not doing the same thing as the existing players. In fact, on most things you're worse than them, and maybe on one thing you're better. And then you can build from there. So I'm going to check this question as answered. There's another question that I've already answered, but I'll read it because it's exactly on point. Trying to force customers to fundamentally change paradigms isn't a priority for enterprise system vendors, and it might even prove counterproductive in the business relationship. Isn't it obvious then for vendors to opt for incremental innovation rather than architecture innovation? Yes. We discussed it at length now, but yes, the customers are also complicit and guilty in this issue. What is the place of Africa in this innovation? Just late adopters, as in the case of the internet? No, I don't think the statement's totally accurate. Obviously, in many, many technological areas, Africa is a late adopter for a variety of reasons, including general economic purchasing power. So certain things just have not been able to roll out through Africa. But what Africa should be thinking about, and what there are some examples of, is leapfrogging, right? Leapfrogging means you're not going to, let's say you're very behind in a certain generation of services and products or technology, and that you're very behind. The right answer isn't probably to say, I'm going to spend the next 20, 30 years building the things that Italy already has, and then we'll move on to the new things that Italy is building now. The real question is, can I just skip a generation and go immediately to the new things? And in some strange cases, it's easier to do that because you don't have the legacy things holding you back. The single best example of this is M-Pesa. M-Pesa is by far, I think, the best story of leapfrogging in Africa and maybe in the whole world. Kenya did not say, great, now we need to spend all types of money building bank branches around the country, because we did not build them in the 50s and 60s and 40s and 70s and 80s the way they did in America and the UK. They developed a system that effectively is mobile money and works with the minimal, it started working with text messaging, which is kind of the lowest common denominator that every cell phone has, right? It wasn't some fancy app that's going to only run on your newest iPhone. It works on text messaging. So and it is one of the highest rates of adoption of mobile money in the world. We always like to joke that if this was happening in Silicon Valley, it would be the super hot startup. And because it was happening in Kenya, it's kind of like more of a curiosity, but it's a great story. And for sure, Kenya conducts more of its banking through mobile devices than Kansas does, even though on most other metrics, including internet adoption itself, it's far behind Kansas. And so I think that it doesn't mean like it's a magic bullet. Africa has multiple developmental topics to address simultaneously, and they're hard. And in many countries, regular power supply is a problem. Transportation is a problem. There are structural factors that impede productivity. But I think it makes it even more incumbent then to say, how can you compete non-traditionally? How can you go around some of these pre-existing problems? How can you skip a generation? How can you leapfrog and go to something faster moving? So I don't think it is just the case that it says here they'll just be late adopters. In at least one very important case, Africa's been a very early adopter, and I hope we will see more in Africa and in many other nations. There are no major cases of blockchain technology deployed in the space other than remittance solutions. Will 2018 be the year where all the experimental developments start being used in the world at large, or will the regulators, financial powerhouses, and financial intermediaries continue to delay the innovations this technology can unleash on the world? The answer to this question is all of the above. I think this is right that the most developed solutions today are remittance-based. I think it's also the case that anything that looks and feels like a traditional financial services product is going to have some level of drag from regulations and entrenched competitors. But I believe it is also the case that we are seeing all types of super interesting ideas being played out, including ones that have nothing to do with financial services. For example, decentralized file storage. That one I don't imagine is going to have any problem whatsoever with financial regulators. It has nothing to do with finances. This summer, we issued all our diplomas on the blockchain on the Bitcoin public blockchain at the University of Nicosia, and you can verify your diploma online. It has zero regulatory or financial implications. The central bank of Cyprus certainly not going to call us to ask why we did it, and it will not be slowed down by a regulation. So I think the regulatory points are primarily true for the topics that touch upon traditional financial services products, because there's pre-existing regulations for those, and a natural reaction is that, well, they should also apply here. Obviously, decentralization and blockchain technology or cryptocurrencies or public blockchains or private blockchains in the service of this topic is far broader than financial services. It is a brand new way to organize human activity. It's a brand new way to coordinate networks of people. And so there will be many non-financial usage cases. What I believe we are seeing is simply the amount of time needed for people to A, get familiar with the technology, B, continue to work on underlying infrastructural issues. Before you can build all the exciting services on top, kind of the base level needs to work. And C, look through things through a new lens. I mean, I'm a broken record on this, but in early days of TV were basically radio shows put on TV. It took a while to figure out that we're going to do new things on TV. Early days of the internet were basically print publications on the internet. it took a long time to go from here's a blog or here's a news site online to Airbnb. And arguably, the technology was more or less there to do Airbnb in 1993, right? I mean, yeah, you couldn't do it on a mobile device, but you could do it on a web browser, right? Like an Airbnb on the web. Approximately could have worked in the mid-90s. And yet, it didn't cross anyone's mind that a system of web-based reviews of people's couches and the people who are going to sleep on people's couches would allow a bunch of strangers to come sleep on your couch, and that would more or less work. It actually sounds crazy to the pre-Airbnb mind, right? Like no one would actually think that it would work. So the technology was all there, but the mental leap to imagine this is possible was not. And that idea was latently available to be done until a couple of people actually figured out that they could do it. And by the way, faced huge resistance even from the venture capitalists whose job is to look for disruptive innovation. There is a great blog post online that is the email conversation between Paul Graham and Fred Wilson. Paul Graham is the founder of Y Combinator, as I'm sure a bunch of you know, and he is one of the greatest writers on startups in the world. And his series of essays are an absolute treasure chest of great resources. In fact, I am going to post them for you because they're a course in and of themselves. And Fred Wilson is one of the greatest. Oh, I guess I cannot post in. Let me see if Andreas can do it. Fred Wilson is one of the greatest early stage startup investors in the world. And there is a fabulous exchange in 2011 between the two of them, and hopefully Andreas can post this, where Paul Graham is trying, Airbnb went through Y Combinator, and Paul Graham is trying to convince Fred Wilson to invest in him. And Fred Wilson, someone who is professionally, his professional capability is uncovering disruptive innovation firms on the internet. Like literally that's what he does. And he is one of the top, I don't know, pick your number, 10, 20, 30 people on planet Earth doing this, right? Out of 7 billion people, there is 20, 30, 50, 10 who's are best in the world at saying, yes, this disruptive thing is going to work on the internet. And he's been doing this for many, many years. And you look at him in the beginning and he can't see it. And it was really, it's an amazing post because they've posted, and they both gave permission to do it, they posted the actual emails they were exchanging back and forth. And Paul Graham had seen it, and Fred Wilson had it. And so they kept going around in circles. Well, Paul and I'm like, no, I know it's this wacky, goofy thing where someone's going to come sleep on your couch, and it's technically your air mattress, right? But there's literally nothing stopping this from starting here and ending up taking on hotels, and in fact, being a booking engine even for hotels. And so, and Fred's like, really? That seems odd. And this was in 2011. The internet existed in the late 60s, right? The web existed in the early 90s. And in 2011 was the first time this particular formulation, this idea was, and some of the smartest people in the world at picking up on if this is a good idea could not see it. So I am very confident there are thousands of applications coming, and we are still very early. So one of the questions in the chat, where are we in the cycle? Are we early adopters? If the question is the broad spectrum of what's available to be done in blockchain technologies and decentralized systems, We're not yet early adopters, I don't think. We're at the beginning of the beginning. The whole concept's 9 years old. All right. 9 years is the internet in the mid-70s. 9 years is email, modern email. SMTP was invented in 1984. So 9 years puts us in 1993. Really modern, the interface for a modern email system, I think, was fairly invented with Gmail, right? So you can get a gigabyte free, and you stop having to worry about space and what have you. That was decades later. So we are still at the phase that people are learning what this is. And the more people learn what this is, the more likely they are to think of new ideas. And to some degree, I hate to say this because it's going to start pushing me on the wrong side of this line, some of the really disruptive ideas are going to come from people who were young when blockchains and cryptocurrencies existed. An interesting tweet by Balaji Srinivasan a few days ago that said, it's been 8,100 days since the Netscape browser was launched. In 8,100 days from now, we're in 2040 or something. And in 2040, someone who is 30 years old will have never been alive during a period where Bitcoin didn't exist. So it's going to be something that was always there and always around. And that's very, very different than someone who, like me, was well aware of what financial systems were, and there's stocks, and there's bonds, and there's cash, and there's gold, and there's oil, and there's pork belly futures. And there's still moments, I'm a major proponent of cryptocurrencies and blockchains and what have you, and I'm still like, it's kind of amazing that a whole gigantic economy and set of human activity is developing around kind of magic, imaginary, invisible internet money, right? Because that's what this is. And so for me, it's still disruptive and shocking. And for many other people my age or younger or older, they're like, this is ridiculous. This doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But for the 22-year-old of 2032, it's going to seem normal that public cryptocurrencies exist. It won't seem anything. I heard a toddler a few days ago ask for a drone to bring him an ice cream cone. He was a 3-year-old kid. If you're 3, you will grow up thinking drones are a normal part of life. If you're my age, drones are still this super exciting, weird, strange thing. Everything flying around and doing things. But if you're 3, it's normal. Well, of course we have drones. Why wouldn't we have drones? Maybe the drones can bring you your ice cream cone. And so it's inevitable that these types of people are going to think about this topic differently. And all of us have blinders, right? Thousands of blinders. All of us can't see everything that could potentially be seen. And a lot of our blinders are built by this is just how things are. And so you develop cognitive shortcuts. And these cognitive shortcuts allow you to function in the world because you can't redesign your view of how the world works every time you make a decision or think a thought. But those cognitive shortcuts are also your blinders. They're also the thing that doesn't let you see that there's maybe a way to do something very, very differently. So I look at cryptocurrency, I look at blockchains, and it's almost impossible to overstate how much innovation is still to come. We still have the first level of innovation, which is just getting people to use it and getting people playing with it and getting the underlying infrastructure working. And then we're going to have the next wave of innovation 10, 15, and 20 years from now for people who have grown up with it natively, and they're going to think of things we haven't even thought of, right, that aren't going to be around in the first generation. And so arguably, even though it seems like it's slow, right, there's an underlying, I see this in this question, and I hear this from people. Well, it's still like 2018 and we're not using cryptocurrency for everything in our lives. Like, why is it taking so long? And why is it going so slowly? That's not accurate. It's a very, very young technology. This was literally a white paper 9 years ago. And that white paper now is supporting $200 billion of value that people have ascribed to various cryptocurrencies and trading around the world and building applications on it. If you had gone back 9 years ago and said, in 9 years, Bitcoin and all its derivatives, I don't mean the forks, I mean every cryptocurrency that came after that, would have a market cap of 200 billion, and there would be miners in the geothermal plants of Iceland, and there will be derivatives and futures being traded on the CME, and people will take the same concept that was, a cash payment system and apply it to file storage and general computation. And many people around the world are going to be totally into it. People would say, well, wow, this is the best case scenario. I mean, really, it's going to be that successful? And so now that successful has happened. And we're like, oh gosh, this is so slow. My life has not been transformed by this yet. I still do many things in normal databases and not in blockchains. It will come. When we decided we wanted to be a part of this area as the University of Nicosia, a key part of our thought process was that this would be something we would keep ourselves productively occupied with for the next 20 to 30 years. That it's not like some short-term thing that, I don't know, Pokemon's going to be hot for 2 or 3 years and then it's not going to be hot, we'll move off to something else. That this was a more fundamental technological idea. And these fundamental technological ideas take a long time to play out because you have to rebuild systems from scratch, both technically and process-wise and even intellectually. So I feel delighted with where the space is. I see a ton of innovation happening, and there's going to be huge experimentation, and we'll see which things stick and which things work. Most blockchains will fail, most cryptocurrencies will fail, most projects built on top of them will fail, just like in everything else. But out of that huge experimentation and failure, some great businesses, networks, technologies will emerge, and 10 years from now, we will have many, many more things than we have today. And we'll still be like, well, gosh, I wish there was more. How come this is not going fast enough? And if we could see now what we're going to have in 10 years, we'll think that it's been a huge success. So, okay, I think I've covered that one sufficiently. Doesn't vertical and horizontal society organization in the industrial base play a significant role in the adoption of process innovations all through the supply chain? Yes, it does. It is B2B innovations, because that's really what we're talking about here, tend to move a little bit slower than B2C innovations because you have to coordinate many more parties with many more processes of their own in order to make the shift. Whereas if you're just offering a service as a startup directly to consumers who don't have their own processes and procedures to adjust, you can usually scale faster and get big faster. The counterpoint to that is it's hard to find a successful consumer idea, right? Getting something that really adds value to consumers is tricky. It's very obvious how business procedures can be made better, because at any point in time in any given industry, there's all types of inefficiencies glaringly visible to everyone in the industry. I mean, everyone. At any point, I mean, if I went to, I don't know, colleagues at universities who do international exchanges, the first thing they'll tell you is the process of course equivalencies is absolutely very silly and inefficient and a nuisance to say, how does this grade from this university translate to this grade to this other university, and what do I credit this course for at my university? So everyone knows it's wrong, everyone knows it can be more efficient, but the process to make it coordinated and more efficient means thousands of universities to change their procedures, and that's hard and slow and doesn't actually happen very easily. Whereas consumers are just people, and people, despite the fact that we're much more technologically advanced than hundreds of years ago, we still have basically the same activities, right? We like sleep for about 7 or 8 hours a day. We eat 3 meals a day. We shower. We spend time with our families. We kind of do something productive to get resources. And so it's not, you usually don't have huge efficiency improvements available for consumers. And so it's hard to find an idea that people latch onto and take off. But when you do, it takes off much faster on the consumer side, because consumers don't have detailed procedures and processes they have to change, and information systems in their household that aren't going to work with the new process and procedure. If you build a better search engine, tomorrow, quote unquote, people can start using it. And they don't need to do an IT integration and convince the CIO to convince the data center manager and the lead developer that we're going to work with a new search engine. We're just going to use a new search engine. So this is absolutely the case that the specific vertical or horizontal structure of an industry will determine how quickly or slowly certain innovations might flow through a specific industry. All right. An incremental innovation makes sense for Apple and naturally compels customers to adopt new upgrades. That is true. Apple is the most successful company in the world ever at getting customers to adopt to new upgrades and give them an awful lot of money. Does Apple allow itself to eventually get disrupted by more radical innovations? I mean, who knows? I mean, probably yes, right? Like, I mean, at some point between now and infinity, Apple won't be around just because of the normal reasons that no company tends to last forever and someone does something new. But, and this is the interesting thing about seeing companies operating at their peak. You know, Apple is right now probably operating at pretty close to their peak, or certainly executing as well as any company has ever executed in the history of the world. And so when they're at the peak, when they're at their most powerful, it's hard to see it, right? Because I read this question, and we're teaching disruptive innovation and radical innovation, and I'm like, yeah, you know, iPhones are pretty good, and people love their iPhones. I'm like, what is the disruptive innovation for an iPhone? And it's not immediately obvious. It's not immediately obvious to me, but that's what things look like when people are at their peak. When Microsoft was at the peak, it looked impervious. It looked absolutely impossible to assault Microsoft. And, you know, by the way, Microsoft will be around for a very long time, but its moat did get assaulted, and got assaulted primarily by the web browser, and with some help from antitrust officials. So conceptually, yes, though I don't quite see it. If I had to guess, by the way, if I had to guess, what disrupts Apple, which they will also try and do because I think they know this. What disrupts Apple is not necessarily a better phone. It's sufficiently advanced AI that you're not using a phone in the first place, and you have, I don't know, like an earbud or something, and you just talk, or you have bone conductivity, so you don't have to talk out loud, and you communicate directly the things you want. Like you can say, call my daughter, and some processing unit somewhere in the cloud does the rest and calls your daughter, and you're not actually necessarily carrying around a physical computer to do that for you. That's probably what disrupts the iPhone. And then, of course, there's going to be a race between Apple and Google and Samsung and probably some firm we haven't heard of yet to try and build and create that. So it's less likely that the way Apple gets disrupted is that someone builds a radically better piece of hardware, because both Apple and its immediate competitors like Samsung are pretty well optimized at building phones now. So the shift is going to be something different, something simpler, and the simpler iPhone might be no phone at all. So if I had to guess, it's in that direction, and so there's going to be a big fight by big firms to try and capture that high ground. Given the S-curve shows correlation between Bitcoin and other tech startups, are there other tools or methods to show accurate correlations between Bitcoin and other financial services products as they emerge? Eventually, can we predict user adoption, business adoption, and penetration in developing countries as a result of these tools? This is a tough question. I mean, there's a lot of frameworks. Another interesting framework, and maybe Andreas can post this, is the Gartner hype cycle. Let me see if I can find it. That says it's their view of how technologies mature, and it's like kind of something happens, and then everyone gets super, super excited, and there is this, they call it the peak of inflated expectations. So the easiest one to think of is the dot-com bubble, right? The internet's going to take over everything. Everyone should become an internet company. Everything's going to be disrupted. We should all immediately leave our current companies, become an internet company. And then after that, that tends to then collapse into the trough of disillusionment, as they call it, because things don't happen as quickly as people thought, as they kind of get depressed and says, oh, this internet thing's not going to happen after all. And they have the slope of enlightenment, as you start figuring things out, and the plateau of productivity, where eventually a technology ceases to be this exciting, dramatic new thing, and it's just something you take for granted, right? Like, through all of our lives, we took electricity for granted. At some point in the past, it was an exciting technology. During my life, we didn't have internet, then we had internet, and so the internet went through all this cycle. And now, if you're born anytime in the last 10 or 15 years, you don't think of having internet access as being a particularly exciting technology. It's kind of like electricity. It's just always there. At some point, this is going to be the case for cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies, that they'll just be there, and just another thing you assume you have available, just like you have electricity available. And so then there's all types of, and Gartner puts out its own reports and says, here's where every technology is on this chart. I think they have crypto somewhere on the peak of inflated expectations right now. But these are not hard analytical methods, right? They're frameworks. They're ways to think through things. It's not necessarily, if you could really predict these things and say this particular technology is going to take off in these particular ways based on some formulaic approach, you could probably make a lot of money out of that. And it's pretty hard to do, right? Like, this is what technology investors try to do for a living, and people get it wrong a lot. And it's two separate questions usually, like what is going to happen, which tends to be the easiest part, and when is it going to happen, which is the hard part, right? Like at any time in the last 50 years, someone could say, someday we will have self-driving cars. But if you had invested in building a self-driving car company in 1990, you would have lost all your money because the technology just wasn't there to allow you to do that then. And so being too early or being too late, it's a truism for investors. It's just as bad as being wrong. And so this is one of the tricky parts, because usually there's a set of circumstances that make something viable at a certain point in time, and some of them are technical and some of them are societal, and some of them sometimes are teams that are forces of nature of their own. And so figuring all of this out and pulling all this together is a difficult question. So I don't think it's formulaic. I don't think anyone can accurately necessarily predict where things are going until markets start to mature. Once markets start to mature, once market starts to mature, then it becomes more predictable. Oh, look, the production of potatoes is likely to go up 2.5% next year because XYZ factors. You can build accurate models for mature markets. It's a little harder to build super accurate models for brand new markets. And this is, people spend a lot of time and energy in research reports, and venture capitalists do their internal reports trying to predict these things. But it's in the early stage, I think it's more of an art than a science, regardless of what anyone might think. Okay, I think these were the pre-existing questions. I'm catching up a little bit on the live chat. I see Andreas is answering the questions about the final exam, which are correct. To the question, is the content and workload in the other MSc classes similar to the MOOC? I'd say it's a little bit more intense. In the MSc classes, they're 6 weeks, not 12. And we get a little bit more in depth. The MOOC is meant to be an introductory course, so it's a little bit lighter weight because we're touching upon many different topics, so we don't get as deep into any specific topic. The rest of the courses, because you're doing a whole course on financial systems or regulation or money and banking, you have the opportunity to go much deeper in those courses. And so I think the content is deeper, first of all, and I think the pace is a little bit more intense than the MOOC. But in practice, as Andreas mentioned, most people are working professionals in the course, and people tend to keep up with it. So completion or lack of attrition tends to be pretty good. Most people manage to stay on track in the course, despite the fact that they're often also working and around the world. Someone else asked, are the live sessions at the same time as the MOOC live sessions? Are we waking up in the middle of the night? Yes, sort of, but it's changing. We're at the point now that we'll be running shortly, certainly starting in 2018, and certainly for sure in 19 and 20, multiple sections of each course. To the degree that we're running multiple sections of each course, we're likely to or at least give people time zone options and say, this course is going to do the live sessions at this time of day, the other section is going to do them at a different time of day, and then people can decide to some degree based on their own schedule, what's the right section that's most convenient for them. So these are some of the benefits of the program getting bigger, that we can open up multiple sections of the same course and handle these types of issues. Is Andreessen the novelist Satoshi Nakamoto? I believe he is not. But he is very much one of the key evangelizers and played a key role in helping bring Bitcoin to the world at large, and absolutely in the course of time will be remembered as one of the early legends of this space. I mean, he must be directly responsible for getting hundreds of thousands of people involved in cryptocurrency. It's an amazing set of things he's done, and he maintains an absolutely punishing schedule to go around the world and give talks and have meetups and spread his views about why this is such an important technology for the world. And so I don't think he's Satoshi, but let's say he's an early disciple, if that makes any sense. Someone asks, is it a good choice to take the MOOC next February as the world changes by the day? Look, we've had some people take the MOOC multiple times. I don't know if I would take it exactly the next session, because we do have changes, but there will be a lot of overlap. Like the Disruptive Innovation section is not going to change. How to make a paper wallet's not going to change. Right? Like some of those things are going to be the same, and some of the other things will be different. So, but I've had several people tell me they've taken the MOOC twice, or I think someone told me 3 times. I think if you space them out a little bit, there will be other topics that do change, and it's interesting. And, you know, because it's the MOOC, you can drop in and out of it and say, look, these sessions are in fact more changed than the other sessions, and so they might be worth engaging with more, and these other ones are more the same. All right, I think we have gotten more or less caught up with the questions. I think we're also at the end of the session time. It's 7 o'clock here. So I'm going to wish everyone a wonderful weekend. Thank you, as always, for a great session and good questions and good participation in the live chat. And we'll see you next week. Thank you very much, everyone.